Hari Om, and greetings from Niagara Falls. There is a well-known Subhashitam. Subhashitam means words of wisdom in Sanskrit that shares, at the time of death, one's best friend is dharma, meaning the way you live. In Srimad Bhagavatam, as Bhagavan Krishna is about to die, he's going to remove his name, his form, his qualities. He shares with Rishi Uddhava that during living, your best friend is the Sangha of sadhus, the association with those who are noble. Whenever we think of nobility, we have different notions that come up, sometimes based on richness, sometimes based on a bloodline. But a wonderful gauge of nobility is inclusivity. The more noble one is, the more inclusive they are. The more inclusive one is, the more noble one is. I can't think of a better modern expression of nobility, inclusivity, than our mentorship sangha. From our team, to all of our mentors and mentees, to our presenters, all we do is invest in inclusivity. This is our best friend while we're alive. This helps us with dharma, which becomes our best friend when we die. I had missed all of you on our February 19th workshop. I was traveling through Varanasi with many of you. I missed all of you in our March 19th workshop. I was traveling from Flint, again with many of you. And so I'm happy that I'm finally in Niagara to be with all of you, especially our silence retreaters. How many of you are part of our silence retreat? They have all been in silence for 57 hours. At least that's what I think they've been doing for 57 hours. This is their 58th hour in living in a most simple way. And what's awesome about this is the subject that we're going to invest in tonight's workshop. At the end of the Ramayana, there's a beautiful valedictory address, like a summary of the Ramayana. And two of the questions posed in this address is, what is the greatest papa and what is the greatest punya? What is the greatest demerit and what is the greatest merit? And the answer given is, the greatest papa is gossiping. The most mean way to live is to gossip. And the greatest punya, the most noble way to live, is by ahimsa. To live in harmony with yourself, with others. This will be the focal point of our wellness workshop. And I'm especially happy that Poonam is sharing today. I've known Poonam since I was in high school, decades ago. I've known Poonam when I was in the Vedanta course, knowing nothing. Now I know a little bit. So we have a long history. And this really shows that noble relationships are endearing. Noble relationships are enduring. My final thought, because our team will tend to announcements later. In 1 week, we will all celebrate Earth Day. In Srimad Bhagavatam, our earth is the symbol for forgiveness. very much like Ahimsa, harmony, and so on. And so our community is working very hard and smart to plant trees and to fund trees. Right now, our community has planted 70 trees and funded $4,824 towards planting trees. I'm encouraging all of us. We all work smart, but to work harder. It is important to learn about Ahimsa. It is equally important to practice Ahimsa. Our earth is an icon of this. So let's do more in terms of planting trees and funding trees. You know about this. We've shared this in so many ways. Please work hard towards this. Team, please continue.
Great. So we'll hand it over to our speaker, Poonam, who'll be talking about nonviolent communication. So Poonam, I'll let you introduce yourself and get started.
Okay.
Oh, you're on mute.
I know, you'd think it after 3 years of Zoom, we'd get it, but okay. Take two. Hariom, everyone. Hariom Vivekji. It's such a kind of pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful to be sharing about this topic. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, not just from a professional standpoint, but really from a personal standpoint. When COVID started, it was quite the journey for me. I think I'm not the person that I was 3 years ago. And so much of my growth and journey, I would attribute to practicing Ahimsa and conversation. So briefly, I'm Poonam. I am a Setugari. I grew up in Chicago at the Badri Mission, did Bal Vihar, and was a proud Chik. And now I am a practicing internal medicine physician and geriatrician. So I work specifically with older adults. And I just bring that in terms of kind of some of the things that we'll be talking today, because a lot of the conversations that we may be having may be with some of our older adults or our parents. So with that, I will. So I'll do a brief introduction to the topic, and then we will do some breakout groups, and we'll leave a chance for question and answer at the end. So why this topic? Vivekji kind of mentioned, that's this idea of harmony, and we look at the world today, and there seems to be less harmony. I'm calling this a post-COVID world, although we're not quite post-COVID, but it's a world where we're short with people. There's not a lot of patience. It's a world where, we spent 3 years, in our shelters, almost fearing each other, right? Who's going to give me COVID? Who do I need to protect myself from? That person's coughing, et cetera, et cetera. And so in this post-COVID world, also just with technology, technology has put us behind screens. The nature of our conversations are different. A lot in text form or 160 characters or less, are many roles. That's another reason why this has been so important to me. As all of you know, we're not just one person. We're one person with many roles. And so for me, just being a parent, having young kids, being the child, having older or having parents that are aging, dealing with coworkers, having a partner. All of these have been, these relationships have really triggered my interest in nonviolent communication. And then finally, my medical practice. I shifted my practice a few years ago to really focus on prevention and wellness, but it's really hard to do that with a patient who communicates very nonviolently, even with their partner. I had a patient who, when I would talk to them, all I had to do was bring up their partner and their blood pressure would shoot up, 30, 40 points. And so, I realized that so much of, the root of many of our physical illnesses, whether it be cardiovascular disease or autoimmune disease, stems from our mental health. And our mental health stems a lot from, how are we interacting with ourselves and how are we interacting with the world around us? And so this is why I wanted to focus on this topic. So I just want to mention 4 scenarios. I'm really just dropping them here with an effort to bring them back later on. This will be part of our breakout session. So the first scenario, your boss wants you to do a presentation and you spend weeks preparing and feel good about your presentation. But during the presentation, you realize you've made a big mistake. And this comes out during the question and answer. So you go home that evening and you have a conversation with yourself about the feedback. Scenario 2, at the end of a long workday, you've come home, you've prepared dinner, you've fed the family, and now it's time to clean the kitchen. So you turn to your partner to have a conversation about who's going to take on this task. Scenario 3, you're in college and you've had a change of heart and decided to pursue political science instead of pre-med, which is what your parents wanted for you. So you pick up the phone to let them know about this change in major. In scenario 4, your aging parents seem to have a growing list of medical issues, and yet they aren't changing their lifestyle with regards to diet or exercise. And they come to you often complaining of the number of pills they have to take or their aches and pains. And so during a conversation, you want to bring up this discrepancy. So I'm going to leave these 4 situations here, let them simmer, and we'll come back to these in our breakout groups. So first, before we talk about nonviolent communication or Ahimsa in conversation, I want to briefly talk about, well, what is violent communication? And, there's the obvious violent communication. You're driving and you get cut off. So that road rage or kind of some passive aggressive responses or the straight up yelling that can happen. Those are obvious forms of violent communication. But I really want to focus today more on those subtle forms of, violent communication. So how do we define violent communication? It's really when we communicate outside of a value system that wants both parties to thrive and flourish. So basically, it's based on domination structures where there's someone of authority, and then there's someone receiving that authority, or where there's good and bad, or punishment and reward. And when communication is done within these structures, it's done so that not all parties can thrive and grow. So though 2 people in this conversation may be talking with a limited tone, they can still have violent communication if they're communicating out of a value system that's allowing both parties to thrive. So that kind of gets us to, well, what is nonviolent communication? So kind of along those lines, well, then nonviolent communication is communication within a value system of compassion and compassionate inquiry. So it's a system where there is no intent of a power structure, but there is equality and support. So it's not based on punishment or reward, but it's based on human needs and whether they're being fulfilled or not. And if they're not being fulfilled, then how do we behave to nurture those needs? So I always like to say that when you're in conversation with someone else, there's really 2 questions that you're asking for both yourself and the other person. And those 2 questions I like to keep in the back of my mind are, what's alive in us at the moment as we're having that conversation? And what would make life more wonderful? And connection at this level is really meant to avoid criticism, avoid blame, avoid insults, avoid demand. And so that's really what we're trying to get to, this conversation of harmony. I really love that word that Vivek to use at the beginning. It really, truly is a harmonious conversation. And that's not to say that you don't bring up the issues you need to bring up. You absolutely bring them up. But there is a way to do that in a harmonious way, in a strategic way, and in a infused in the work that Mahatma Gandhi did. But here in the United
When we
States,
lost you for 1 second, can you start back at the Meet Marshall Rosenberg slide?
sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Your Zoom just cut out for a second.
Sure. So, so Marshall Rosenberg was someone who brought nonviolent communication to the United States. He was an American psychologist. He was a mediator. He was an author. And basically in the mid-1960s, he developed nonviolent communication as a process to support partnership and resolve conflict for people within themselves, but also in relationships and in society. So he started this nonprofit organization known as the Center for Nonviolent Communication. And he grew up in Ohio and he witnessed the race riots. And after seeing that, he asked himself two questions. He said, what happens to humans to participate in others' suffering? And what happens to humans to allow them to stay connected to their compassionate nature? And then he went on to, study psychology. And then he realized that, it's through nonviolent communication that we can actually connect with each other, that we can actually kind of infuse that compassion, not only in the way we talk to ourselves, not only with our partners, but he went on to go to different inner cities and help gangs resolve conflict among themselves. He went on to work with countries to help countries resolve conflict among themselves. And at one point in a year, he was visiting 35 different countries, traveling as a peacemaker. So he came to realize that, it's through compassion, through conversation, in conversation, that's how we're meant to live. And he really was able to look at different religions and find that really compassion is at the base, at the foundation of these different at the root of what the message was. And so he developed this tool, and we'll delve into that tool, but it culminated in a book that he wrote called Nonviolent Communication: A Language of Life. And I highly, if you want to delve into this topic further, I highly recommend that book, and I can drop it in the chat later. So let's look at the tool itself. This is where we're going to spend a lot of our time, and this is where we'll, keep revisiting this paradigm here as we're in our breakout groups. So there's 4 elements to nonviolent communication. It's observation, feelings, needs, and requests. And over the years, I've repeated that to myself many times: observation, feelings, needs, and requests. So when you're in a conversation with someone else, you begin with observation. So that is the concrete actions that we observe that affect our well-being. And I'll delve into each of these a little bit further. Second is feelings. So how we feel in relation to what we're observing. We're seeing what's happening in front of us. How does that make us feel? The next component of this are the needs, values, and desires that create those feelings. So the feelings that we have, why are they being created? It's searching for the needs, values, and desires that are creating those feelings. And lastly, it's request. It's a concrete action that we request of someone else to enrich our lives. So we can delve into each of these a bit further. So observation. What you want to do when you're in a conversation with someone is you start with an objective, non-evaluative statement. And that's actually quite hard to do, to make an observation that's free of judgment, that's free of criticism, that's free of any form of analysis. But the reason this is, I would argue, one of the most important stages is because what you say to the other person in this observation phase sets the stage to whether the other person is really going to listen to what you have to say. So let me give you some examples. So you might look to your partner and say, you never do what I want. That, when your partner hears that, it's gonna, be the eye roll and the hands that get thrown up, and it's like, okay, I don't want to listen to what the rest of what you have to say. Versus being more specific, again, being objective and being very specific to the situation. So instead of saying you never do what I want, saying maybe, the last 3 times I've tried to initiate an activity, you said you didn't want to do it. Let me give you another example. So if you say you often don't listen when I'm speaking, that's making an assumption. A lot of people listen, though they're not giving eye contact. So can't really, assume that they're not listening. So instead of that, saying, again, being very specific, in our meeting today, I noticed that you were on your phone. So starting with a simple observation. After that, it's feelings. So expressing our feelings can be very difficult because we actually are not often asked to do that. In fact, kind of in the American language, we tend to use the word feel without actually expressing a feeling. When we say feel, we tend to, we tend to express what we think we are, not actually how we feel. So this is going to take a little bit of retraining to actually get down to the feelings and understand how you feel. So it's subtle, but for example, if I say something like, I feel inadequate as a flute player, by saying inadequate, I'm actually making a judgment about how I think I play versus actually how I feel, right? I feel disappointed in myself as a flute player, or I feel frustrated with myself as a flute player. Disappointment, feeling frustrated, those are feelings. The other important thing is to try to not be so vague. So like good is it's a vague word, right? So instead of saying I feel good about X, Y, and Z, be specific. Like I feel excited about X, Y, or Z, or I feel eager about X, Y, or Z. So you really want to give yourself the vocabulary of feelings when your needs are met or when your needs are not met. And to do that, there in nonviolent communication, there's actually a list of feelings, that Rosenberg had described when your needs are met, and a list of feelings that you may have when your needs are not met. So it may be worthwhile to look at that. If you really struggle with getting down to your feelings, to maybe look at those vocabulary of feeling words. I might plug also, Brene Brown, and she wrote Atlas of the Heart. It's really kind of looking at this dictionary of feelings and really understanding them. So we want to really broaden our vocabulary of feelings. And the other thing about feelings is we also really need to take responsibility for our feelings. So let's say someone in conversation says something that maybe you take offense to. We can really respond to that in 4 ways, or a combination of those 4 ways. So one is, something says something to us, we can blame ourselves. We can say, oh yeah, that person's right. I really should, be different, or I really should be X, Y, or Z. The other thing we could do is blame them, like, oh, what do they know? So we could place the blame on them. We can go down to the feeling level, so we can sense our own feelings and needs. Or we can sense the other person's feelings and needs. What unmet need do they have that they need to make that particular comment? And it's really the third and fourth thing of sensing our own feelings and needs and sensing other people's feelings and needs. We want to get down to that level as opposed to blaming others or blaming ourselves. So that's feelings. We really want to develop our vocabulary of feeling and really be in touch with our feelings. Again, not what we think we are, but actually how we feel. And then there's needs. We want to connect our feelings to what unmet needs we have. And we really want to be clear about that unmet need. What is that unmet need to have? Because if we can't express it, or if we express it indirectly through either evaluations or interpretations, other people are going to hear that as criticism. But we really want to directly connect our feelings to our needs so that it makes it easier for the other person to respond to us compassionately. And if we don't value our own needs, or if we don't even know our own needs, how are other people going to respond to that? So this is where in conversation, you may need to pause, or you may need to say, you know what, I'm going to need to circle back. Give me a minute here to really figure out what it is I'm asking, because I need to first figure out what unmet need do I have. Rosenberg described 9 different needs that we have, and I think intuitively it makes sense. These are 9 needs that human beings have. One is, sustenance, safety, love, understanding or empathy, creativity, recreation, sense of belonging, autonomy, and meaning. And so kind of, thinking about these in conversation, when you're having, a negative feeling, figuring out which of these here are not being met, because that's going to need to come up in the conversation. But part of that is going to require reflecting on your needs. And then lastly, it's the request. So what is your request of others in order to enrich your life and others? And you want to try to frame this in the positive, right? So you, instead of saying, there's this great example that Marshall gives. So there's a couple, and the husband spending a lot of time at work, and the wife says, stop spending so much time at work. And so one would think, okay, she's making a request, but the question is it specific enough? Because the husband then says, okay. And so he signs up for some sports classes. And so instead of spending time with the wife at home, he is now, instead of at work, he's doing sports classes. Did he do what she said? Yeah, he's not spending as much time at work. But what did she really mean? She meant to say, please spend more time with me. And so it's just an example to show that we really want to make sure that we have very concrete actions that we want the other person to undertake. And this takes creativity. This takes, for us to really kind of think outside the box. And it makes us proactive, right? We're not just telling the other person, you figure it out. We're saying, hey, this is my specific request. And it's really important to not package your request as a demand. That's when the other person stops listening. So really compassionate conversation is really that we're just making a request. What the other person does has to be within the context of their feelings and their needs. And they're going to need to consider our requests. So we're not making demands, we're just making a request. So that's the 4 steps. And before we kind of get into some reflection, saying no is really hard. That's something that I found in these past 3 years, and I'm really learning how to do it. And I really think it's an art, and there is a way to apply nonviolent communication to the art of saying no, and it's using some of this same framework. It's let's say you're in a conversation with someone. Let's say it's your mom who's telling you to clean up your room. The first thing is to receive the request as a gift, an opportunity. That's a really important step, to look at your mom as she's telling you this and saying, and not thinking, she's trying to destroy my life. She's trying to, distract me from what I'm trying to do. It's saying, no, she has this genuine feeling and unmet need, and she's conveying this through a request. So you're accepting her request for you to clean up your room as a gift and an opportunity. Do you have to take up that gift and opportunity? No, but it's a frame. It's changing your how you're thinking about it. So first, receive the request as a gift and opportunity. Next, state what need prevents you from saying yes. So if I'm, doing some homework and I can't clean my room at that time, it's saying, I need to be able to manage my time properly. I have this need to have autonomy over my time. And so saying, Mom, I'm actually working on my homework. I can't do it at this time. Now, if you stop there, there's irritation, right? It's like, well, you're saying no. So then that third step is really important. End with a request that searches for a way to get your need met, but also your mom's need met. Whether it's, Mom, I really need to finish this work right now, but can you give me 10 minutes and I'll be able to clean my room then? Or maybe it's thinking outside the box, like, Mom, I'm working on this homework, but Pooja is free. Why don't you ask Pooja to help clean up? But at least it's searching for, being creative and offering your mom those solutions, so that it's not just shutting your mom down. Nope, I can't clean my room. It's saying, hey, I'm willing to work with you. I hear that you have this need to have the house in a certain way. Is there a way that we can meet halfway? So I'll just encourage framework to that. And then the other thing I'll just add to this is that, nonviolent communication, it's really a reciprocal exchange. You want to be able to express honestly through the 4 components, but you also have to receive empathically through the 4 components. And to do that, it really requires listening abilities. And so as you're applying the framework in conversation, as you're conversing and putting out into the conversation, you also have to receive. And so it really goes both ways. so with that, I was hoping to just, so before we go into the breakout groups, I was hoping to just take a few minutes of reflection, and ask that in the past week, is there an instance or two that you can think of where you could have applied nonviolent communication? And if you can think of those, put yourself in those scenarios, can you apply the tool of observation, feeling, need, and request? Can you kind of go through that role play and see maybe how the conversation would have gone differently, or how the message would have been received differently with the person that you were having the conversation with? So maybe we'll take it just a few minutes, maybe like 5 minutes to do that. And then we'll come back and then after the 5 minutes, and we'll break up into the breakout sessions. So hopefully you've gotten a chance to kind of think back to a couple instances this past week. I know as I was thinking back, I was like, oh, I should have maybe reacted differently, but also it's important to apply the nonviolent communication tools to ourselves too. As we talk to ourselves, we have to apply that as well. But all right, so we're gonna now break out into the breakout groups. So the goal for this is we're gonna take about 10 minutes, and in a group, there were the four, if I can advance this. There were the 4 scenarios that I had brought up at the beginning of the presentation. And so leave it up to your group. You can take any of these scenarios, all of these scenarios. You can, some of the scenarios that came up during this reflection, you can bring that up as well. But the goal is kind of as a group, what would violent communication look like? And then what would nonviolent communication look like as you're about to have these conversations? And just to remind you guys that scenario 1, your boss, your presentation didn't go right, and you're now thinking about it as you head back home in the evening. Scenario 2, it's a long work day, you're really tired, and now your kitchen's a disaster and you're about to talk to your partner. Scenario 3 is you're telling your parents about a big life change that you've decided to make. And scenario 4 is that you're having a conversation about with your aging parents about their health. And so I think Gunjan will divide everyone into groups, and then we'll take 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for the question and answer. I mean, that's a great question. I think it starts off with, no one knows what's in your head except you. And you are not expected to know what is happening in someone else's head or heart or their feelings. And so the beauty of this is your request in this conversation could be, my understanding is that you're feeling this. Am I understanding you correctly? And just putting that out there to say, and that gives them the opportunity to then say, wait, no, you've got this all wrong, or no, that's spot on. So I think it's just putting out that request to say, this is my understanding of what's going on. Do I have this right or not? And just take responsibility for what's in here, and ask for clarification. So I feel like that this could definitely be a talk in and of itself. And I think it's so near and dear to a lot of our hearts as our parents are getting older, or patients are getting older. And I think, it comes down to understanding the framework. I think it comes down to understanding that, what we ask of our parents or our patients, they are requests. They're not demands. And this idea that it's going to be a process. So never thinking that like you're going to go into a conversation and you're going to get answers and solve things. I think this is, everyone's learning, everyone's growing. And I think just knowing that this is not one conversation, but many conversations is one thing. And really respecting their autonomy. There are going to be conversations where, we have to respect the autonomy of the older patient or person or parent. And that can be very hard because the requests may not be aligned. I think it's trying to find some middle ground, and to do that, you have to give, you have to pivot. And that's a really hard thing. It's a really hard thing to see your loved ones kind of do things that you don't want them to do, but that's part of their process. And so all you can do is, again, engage with them in this compassionate way, and just know that it's a process. It's never just a one and done. So the same framework applies to oneself. And again, you enter this, compassionate relationship with yourself. And it's going through the entire thing. It's looking at the failure and saying, first of all, being objective about it. So we often are really hard on ourselves. And as we were talking in our breakout group, that observation part of it is really so that we are making sure that we're not adding stories, or we have these narratives about what happened, being very objective. So not saying, oh my gosh, that was a disaster. It's saying, being very specific, especially in the observation phase, like, I forgot to mention this detail, or whatever the issue was. And then kind of going through the framework saying, this made, I feel very embarrassed, or I felt very disappointed in myself. And what was the unmet need? Maybe it's a need to perform. Maybe it's a need to, grow. And then finally, it's making a request of yourself and saying, hey, I'm going to do it differently next time, or, next time I'm going to make sure I have my notes. And, you come up with a creative way to not allow that to happen in the future. And so it's just applying the same framework. And the more you do it, the more of a habit it is, the easier it becomes. And I will say, the more people in your Sangha that are doing it as well, there's empathy there. When you're pausing because you're doing the process, people understand, okay, she's going through the process. Like, let me give her some space so that she can do that. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Poonam, for this session and for guiding us through this framework. I think it was, hearing from our group discussions too, it was really eye-opening. I felt like we were all able to figure out how to apply it in many different dimensions of our lives. So it was very useful. And I think there's also a lot of maybe hope for you to come back and do a session, maybe specifically on some of around aging parents and the elderly. But we appreciate this time. You all, Hari Om, everyone.